May 5th, 1975, I came to the Washington Post from the Miami Herald, in case you were wondering. Saw an ad in the Columbia Journalism Review saying the Washington Post was looking for minorities. And I just learned at the Miami Herald that the way to get a raise was to have an offer from somewhere else. And that's all I really wanted, an offer from the Washington Post so I can get a raise at the Miami Herald. And ended up, bam, getting the job. Washington was intoxicating. I'd never seen architecture like this, for one. Those big government buildings, the Capitol, and of course, the Washington Post. When they started sending me subscriptions to the Washington Post after offering the job, these big things came. They were thick as a tree trunk. The big Washington Post. Never seen a newspaper that fat before. Yeah, I wanted to be a part of that. I think at that time, when I started, I wasn't that clued in on the implications of Watergate. Nixon would resign later, but how that happened, I had no clue. I mean, it was all new. I didn't know anything about how Washington, quote, worked or how a newspaper could have the impact. So it was all a very curious place. That's what I like. But I knew one thing about Washington, and that it was a predominantly black city, and that as big as those newspapers were, the big tree trunk log-sized newspapers, there was very little in them about black people. And I said, yes, that was good for me. Mm-hmm. The first time I saw him, it was like, you got to know this guy. Yeah, he was quite charming. He did the final say on who got the job. And I don't remember the exact, this was 1975, but I remember him saying, you're a charmer. And he did his little charming thing, and I did my charming thing, two charmers. I think charm was more important to him than curiosity, which was high on his list. With charm, you could get people to answer a question before the question was even asked. It was great. He was cool. He was called a Boston Brahmin, and I thought Brahmins were bulls. And for the longest time, I thought they meant that Ben was a bull, the Brahman, as opposed to the Brahmin, And it worked for a while. It fit. He was the bull, king of the barn. So, yeah, I liked him a lot. Well, quite frankly, I was more concerned with the manual typewriters and rotary telephones and how to get a story in. The reason that I was able to stay, I believe, was because there were just enough black people with just enough history to give me some pretty good guidance on it. But the newspaper, the content of the paper that I saw in Miami before I came to the Post, I could see how it got that way when I came to the Newsroom. But that was good. That means there was a spot. I had a spot. My first beat was just feature writing. I was sent out to Prince George County, which was becoming a predominantly black county with all of the tensions that go with population displacements and things like that. Only in this case, black people were turning Prince George County into the first county in the country in which, as white people moved out and black people moved in, the county became wealthier and more educated, which was a phenomenon. And I like that. That's where the action was. When the conflicts between people, different people rubbing up against each other, and how people adjust. It was a great story, and how the police adjusted. Well, he was elected mayor in 1978, 3 years after I came to the Post, but he'd already been on the school board and had a reputation as an activist. In fact, he was a very important activist in the civil rights movement, part of the SNCC group, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. and someone I got to know well and liked also. You know, he and Marion made a good inside-outside pair to work off of. Very dynamic figures. The city was, I could not have imagined a place like Washington, D.C. It was at once a very southern city, and I'm from the South, deep South Louisiana, and I found myself right at home here in terms of the people that I'd be writing about. But it was also an international city with embassies from around the world, and a national city in which all of those southern politicians that I was thinking I was getting away from had been sent right to Washington. So it was that mix, and it made for a dynamic place. Don Graham, more than any other publisher of the Post during my time, they wanted the paper to be essentially local. And he was very supportive of carving out that one aspect of the city, which was the black community. And that was really good for me. Ben Bradlee had different ideas. He wanted the paper to be national. And his secret wish, and I wish he had let it be known, was that he wanted to rival the New York Times. You know? And the way you did that was through impact journalism, or if I may say so, the holy S-H-I-T stories. You know? And he eventually got him big time. You know, he wanted it, and it was, hey, let's, this is what I really liked, because growing up in the South, everything was pretty conservative. Even the newspapers that I worked at before, people were pretty straight-laced. We have to represent, you know, we're upholding standards and stuff like that. Ben wanted to mess with it. And I thought, oh, this is just great. You know, this guy, this bull, this Brahmin bull, you know, is ready to tear up the China shop. And I thought this was absolutely fantastic. Journalism, yes. He put journalism, my dad was a journalism teacher in high school, and I was in his homeroom class. And I found that the basics of journalism didn't change even when I got to the Washington Post: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Inverted pyramid, lead, so what graph, kicker on the story. Didn't matter where you went, those were essential. The rest was what kind of shine you would put on them. And for what was essentially a trade, okay, a trade. Ben turned it into a profession, you know. Newsprint became silk paper, and the ink was black gold. You know, oh, it was glamorous, you know, just very glamorous, and with power to boot. You know, that was the thing that I had never experienced. I know you could make people read, but I didn't know that you could make people act on what they read as much as I saw happen at the Washington Post. For him, it could be incremental. It started with what he didn't know. If you wrote something about the black community that he didn't know, which was like anything, you know, he'd come and be just fascinated with it. And if something happened to be bizarre, he was like, wow, you know. So you got a glimpse of what turned him on, you know. He had some prurient interests, I thought, you know. The pathologies kind of got him really worked up. He was essentially a political animal, though, because he understood the top part of the city, but he wanted that bottom on it, too. You know, he wanted to get there. And, well, he did with Janet Cooke. There were public housing projects, but this had been the case all along. I mean, the way the city had been set up, poor black people were being pushed to the edges of the city. Urban renewal had just, you know, did a job on black communities and just, you know, displaced people, put everybody in these tall boxes type things, or these flat boxes or whatever. But there were families. These were families that had been displaced from poor but stable communities in Southwest Washington, which was clear to make way for a highway. The highway from the Pentagon to the Capitol, so that those guys could move back and forth, you know, cleaned out a huge swath of the black community, and people were displaced. And then once they were displaced to southeast, another highway came from Andrews Air Force Base, to the capital, dividing it even further and pushing more people together. It was, it was really bad. But people were still struggling against, all odds. People wanted, parents wanted their kids to go to school. People wanted to be safe. But people wanted to survive, and so there was drugs. There was a way to make money. And those very highways that had split the community turned out to be a good way for the suburbanites to come in and get their drugs. And the economy, the underground economy, took root, in a powerful way. And that was Southeast Washington. But that was the part of Southeast Washington where, if you wanted to go looking for those colorful criminal characters, you could go there. The city was interesting like that. We're talking about a very small city geographically, maybe 100 square miles altogether. And the city is basically geographically in a bowl. And the Capitol is in a bowl. In the bottom of the bowl, so is the monument, Washington Monument. And on the rim of the bowl, you'd have Southeast Washington. The poorest people in the city had the best view of the city. So you could see the Capitol. And you go to these crime scenes, the murder scenes, and there were dead bodies there, and the Capitol dome, and it would gleam in the full moon. It would just gleam, and there were lights on the Lincoln Memorial that lit it up at night, and you'd have dead black men in the streets of the nation capital, and the Lincoln Monument, glowing as if it was a star. It was an amazing contradiction. And I think it also was an agitating thing. You could see the promise of the country, the promise of the city, everything that it was supposed to represent: equality, freedom, justice, and all around it was the injustice. The people who picked up on this contradiction and used it to great effect was the Soviet Union in their propaganda. America talks about all this greatness of this, democracy and capitalism. Look at this. And they would put it in Pravda, that very scene, the shanty town, the shacks, and the Capitol dome rising out of the middle of it, This was, quite frankly, a big motivating factor for people to start doing something about race. They did not like getting their butts kicked by the Russians on, communism versus capitalism, and look at what capitalism was doing. A racist system, oppressive system. So people started trying to do something. And among the things that people started trying to do, bring more black people into the newsrooms to better chronicle what was happening, to give voice to the voiceless. So there was a lot of movement after a while, a lot of movement, social unrest, and America trying to live up to the promise, but it was all people trying to, making it up as they went along. These were ideals that the newspaper was striving for. The Kerner Commission report in '67 pointed out what the shortcomings were. The black community was being viewed through, quote, white eyes and just missing the story. And it was true. It was true. But there were remedies for it. Get people who could interpret. I didn't like the idea of using Black Washington as a foreign country. You're going in and interpreting what natives speak for white audience, but that was a process. People had to go through that. The paper was essentially a white newspaper with a white audience. And you can't overlook the fact that this is a business that had a market, and the paying customers were, white people from, suburbs, the international community, and black people had black newspapers, so. But that was a huge market to ignore, and I think Phil Graham, one of the more progressive owners recognize that. You know, we've got all these people here and none of them reading the paper. You know, why are we letting that money go? Janet Cooke. Janet Cooke was just a regular person in journalism. And, you know, understand we're talking about a newspaper. We're not talking about people with great literary skills coming in, having written great American novels. These are people who are writing stories about the inch. You know, it was a team effort. You know, you write a story, editor edits it, and moves it on up the line. She was not special. And I say that in terms of how she was received by this Trump. If you read any story about Janet Cooke, it was about how she walked, how she sashayed, you know, how she arced her neck, how she flung her hair, her weave, by the way. You know, and the fact that people didn't know what a weave was and they thought it was, you know, like, wow, she's really, and I don't think she was trying to bluff. It was that people had never seen anything. And when I say people, I'm talking about white people, the editors. You know, they just didn't see any. This was new to them, but it was all about the resume also. She came in as a Vassar graduate, Sorbonne, speaking foreign languages, you know. And that's what turned people on, Phi Beta Kappa and all that kind of stuff. They saw the paper, they wasn't really looking, you know, at who she really was. But to put a woman like that out on the 14th Street prostitute drug dealer beat, that said something. Here's a woman who was billed as a great writer, great clips, Vassar, and they put her out on the street with prostitutes. Say, that's very telling. You know, very telling. Paper couldn't. She should have been out in the suburbs, covering city government with a resume like that. That's what you do, people resumes like that, and quickly move them on into, you know, different places. But no, she was locked down on the streets. It was pretty bizarre. But it's been said that the black men didn't like her because she wouldn't date them and all that. That's not true. No, she was just a different kind of person. You know, it's like she was kind of off-putting. She was hiding something, you know, and I kind of knew. Everybody had to kind of put on a little mask to get in, because understand this, we were in the process of integrating. When Janet Cooke arrived at the Post in 1980 perhaps, the paper was still in the process of integrating. I mean, racial integration that had begun, you know, a decade maybe so ago in earnest, was still underway. And people didn't recognize it. They thought that integration meant lunch counters, back of the bus type things, but fair housing. But those were physical aspects, and this was psychological integration. And it was arguably as damaging as being beat up, because it messed up many of mine. But this was black and white too, but there was something particular about black people trying to integrate into a white institution, you know. Because the idea was, can you think like us? Can you perceive the world the way we do? I came with a view based on my segregated background that this is what I wanted to do. Some people just came to work without a particular point of view, and they were ready for what I would consider the old eye implant. The Post would give them an eye, a way of seeing the world. You know, and Janet Cooke, I believe, got a little eye implant and wanted to see the world the way, you know, she thought people wanted it to be seen. And it really tripped her up, really tripped her up. It was a peculiar kind of jackpot. I think there was fool's gold in this jackpot, because again, she was not actually treated like a woman who'd gone to Vassar. She was treated, you know, like someone who dropped out of high school. But, you know, and she wanted to get out of that. She really did, badly. And her desire to get out of that, you know, peg, created a drive in her that was, you know, it was abnormal. But I don't want to judge her. I understand. It was a tension-filled newsroom and designed that way. When I came to the paper, there was great competition against the Washington Evening Star. You didn't want to be scooped by the Star. So you had the tension that came to be called creative tension, which was the competition, originally stemmed from external places. You have competition that's outside. Now it's brought inside because everybody, you know what the competition is. You come in, people say, why didn't we have this story? So you go out and you don't want to get beat. You don't want to get scooped by the Washington Star. Well, the Washington Star died, and the tensions really didn't have much place to go. But anyway, the point being that there was tension created in the newsroom, a competitiveness. Left mismanaged, people would compete against themselves, each other, intramural. And I think Janet Cooke got caught up in, figuring that she was supposed to be competing against someone for something, who she perceived as her competitors, I guess other blacks. Because the Post didn't, there seemed to be only room for one black here, one black there. There wasn't going to be room for everybody. There was one, and she wanted to be it. So every other black person was kind of like, going to be elbowing her out the way, which was not true, but, it was understandable that she would begin to think that way. She wrote for the Weekly once a week, and when you write when I started journalism, you could easily write 2 stories a day for for newspapers. You wrote stories, and especially if your beat was the little civic association feature type thing. She wrote about beauty pageants. She wrote about events. On the community calendar, you pick an event and you write about it. You stack them up and put them all in the paper one time. Yeah. Not taking anything away from it, but journalism is a team sport. She had editors, editors who knew that Ben Bradlee was interested in this person. And when Bradlee is interested in a person, his managing editor, Howard Simons, would send the word, make it work. You don't fail, you make it work. And she had the right cards, she had the right mentors, everything, and they were going to make it work for her. So. The stories weren't, I didn't think they were all that. But again, when she started getting into the, writing about the prostitutes and the pimps, so they was, oh, here we go, holy shit. And when she found out that this was it, it's like, let's go do more. I'm going to holy shit myself onto the national desk, out of this. Well, yeah, it made sense. It was the way the game was played. I heard about it when she started working on it in earnest. Apparently it had gone through, she'd started out working on one thing, it evolved into this, and then the 8-year-old heroin addict she had found, and that's when I heard about it. I thought, wow, this is going to be this is going to really be a holy shit story. And was curious to see how it unfolded. Who was this person? Now, I'd heard stories. You always hear stories about the drug world. As the nation of Colombia and South America began to up in the cocaine thing as we got into the disco era, you'd hear all kind of things. The little baby coming into Dulles Airport that's dead but stuffed with cocaine, or coffins full of dope and all kinds of most bizarre stories. Some may have been true, some may have been like urban legends. But if you had one, and wow, this is going to be pretty bizarre. Then it became a secret, how it was coming along. I talked to her editor, who she just didn't believe, this was the first editor on the Weekly, didn't kind of believe that she had the chops to pull that off. She could barely find a way around town. But here she went. And nobody saw the story until after it ran. And then I was like, holy shit. The story was full of it changed my view about a lot of things about what people were prepared to believe and overlook. It wasn't that the piece was packed with details that would make you believe it. It was all the stuff that was missing. You know, it was incredible. It was the craziest thing I'd ever read. You know, but people were buying it. You know, and I thought, wow, this is. And when it won the Pulitzer Prize, of course, it was like the Pulitzer board became shit to me. You know, that was like, this means nothing. You know, if people believe that, you know, to hell with it. Jimmy is 8 years old and a third-generation heroin addict, a precocious little boy with sandy hair, velvety brown eyes, and needle marks freckling the baby smooth skin of his thin brown arms. My God, am I supposed to really keep on? Listen, okay, make it into like one of those Grimm brothers fairy tales. Oh, and here comes the Wicked Witch of the West Witch. He nestles in a large beige reclining chair in the living room of his comfortably furnished home in Southeast Washington. There is an almost cherubic expression on his small round face as he talks about life. Clothes, money, the Baltimore Orioles, and heroin. He has been an addict since the age of 5. Remember, this Jimmy is not the first Jimmy. This is the second Jimmy. There was, you know, she couldn't find the first 8-year-old Jimmy, so she came up with a new Jimmy that did not have a trail. The other Jimmy would have been found through a rehabilitation center, so you could track whether or not it was real or not because it was attached to something. This Jimmy was not attached to anything. Jimmy went to school, but we don't know what school he went to, you know. Jimmy had parents. The story was just blatantly crazy. Come on, people. But that's a long time ago. Again, the point being that in our business, you know, perceptions of who we are and what we do it's all over the place. And one of the problems with the newspapers not covering black communities is you could get away with this stuff. People didn't have a clue. Now, to Ben's credit, he already said, I don't know anything about this. And he wanted to learn. I mean, he really worked at it. In fact, in some ways, he actually started the movement toward hiring black people to know more about the community in 1952, a year after I was born. In fact, he was a police reporter for the Washington Post, covered a race riot over swimming pool integration in Southeast Washington. You know, that started a ball rolling that continued on through the riots and was there in, you know, still steaming along when he got back to the Washington Post. But the coverage was just pathetic. It was pitiful. In fact, let's be frank, it was racist. Ben even said so. You know, it was racist. People did not like black folk. The Post was complicit in fomenting a race riot in 1919. A different version of the Post, of course, the same major newspaper. You know, basically advertising, here's where the militia should be tomorrow so we can kick some Negroes' butts. And they showed up in race riot. This is bad history, bad blood between the Washington Post and the black community, based on stereotypes, based on ignorance, you know, and based on wanting to maintain the power, you know, a view of the world, you know, as people had already known it. Nobody wanted to rewrite those mental maps. You know, this is how the world is. It's a white-dominated world. We want to keep it that way. These other guys are just visiting slaves, ex-slaves moving through. You know, we did. When I started the Post, one of the most interesting calls I got was from a guy with a real Southern accent, and he says, how can you use the white man's invention to criticize the white man? Who do you think invented your newspaper presses? You know, and that was the view. I mean, I liked it because that was it. You know, how dare you? This is our stuff. I remember one time that I wanted to do an open mail bag and put some of this stuff, because when Reagan came into office, which is about the same time Janet Cooke came, we was talking about welfare queens, and it was just out. Things just came out. People were just, this was the first time people would call you, you know, derogatory names and sign their name to it and their addresses. And I was surprised that these addresses were Connecticut Avenue. These were in the, you know, the good, smart, wealthy part of town. And I said, oh, I got to do my mailbag on this. And Ben didn't like that idea. He thought, you know, they represent a minority. You know, a lot of people don't, most people don't think like that. Oh, I wish he was alive now to see the Donald Trump era. Oh my goodness, yes, yes, yes. But, you know, Janet Cooke walked into that. She walked into a time when Reagan and his welfare queens and his Cadillac mamas and the the loafing, lazy black men were all out there. And it was like, this is different. Before Reagan got into office, the view was that if you wrote about some social ill, somebody would do something about it. It was just a matter of letting people know what was happening, and then the better angels would emerge, and we deal with it. Well, by the time Janet Cooke came, that was not the way it worked. You know, you put that out there, and people say, "See, we told you." You know, how low can they go? You know, that was the question. You know, what is the bottom of the barrel? And she came, well, look, there's Jimmy. You know. But it was such a cartoon. I couldn't believe people, but people were predisposed to believe it, even with that little cartoon picture and all the things. She went out looking for a new, more potent kind of heroin, first of all, because it was killing people, right? But here you have an 8-year-old who'd been on it since he was 5, you know, and going to school talking about, I want to be a math man because I can count and do all this stuff. It was just too funny. And she found him by putting business cards in the playground, and somehow it got to Jimmy's mom, who called her and said, I'm Jimmy's mom, why are you looking for mom? So they had him, you know, they got together for a meeting. Anyway, it said something about the psyche. It was part of an institutional psyche that it was a holdover. It was a holdover from old racist days, Southern stereotypes. You know, these people are like animals. Because of that first Jimmy, they thought that this was the first one connected to the there was the first Jimmy was connected to a rehabilitation center, but it was not clear how old he was or what that maybe this person had somehow gotten into a stash, you know, accidentally, and you know, and been taken to, or someone who had been born with, you know, heroin withdrawal type syndromes, or someone who had been used to transport the drugs into, you know, in a diaper or something, and it got, you know, and absorbed. There's some bizarre kind of thing that had happened. But that person was no longer 8 by the time it came up, you know. I mean, that particular person was, you know, grown up, and well, at least in late teenager, and all that other stuff was behind them, to whatever extent it was. But it certainly wasn't a mainlining kid doing that. And that's what Marion Barry, the mayor, and other people thought she was talking about. They thought that she had, you know, when they said, we know who this is, you know, they said, yeah, we know how, because he knew the people at the RAP, which was the name of the rehabilitation drug rehab program. And he knew how, he thought maybe, yeah, okay, we know who it is. You know, and they tracked it down to see if, you know, was this person still, and they found out and they called it off. Yeah, they thought they knew it was, but that wasn't the one. It was the new Jimmy, you know, the one that she had, you know, claimed was still out there. So the city went into a tizzy, and when they realized that it was not the one, they basically called it off. Now, it's very hard, as the smarter people know, to disprove a negative. You know, and you can't say that Jimmy didn't exist because, you know, how could you say that? And that was the whole catch. Nobody could really say it. But if you looked at that story, I don't see how you couldn't. The Post had a golden reputation for taking the unbelievable story in Watergate, just the most unbelievable story, and showing, yes, you know, these third-rate burglars did this thing. and got, and the president came down. Who would have thunk it, you know? So you put something like Jimmy in the Washington Post, and this is the power of the story. It was not the story, it was the vehicle. You use the Washington Post for that, where people just knew that you don't get, whatever you got in the Post, it was going to be true, as wild as it may sound, because they had proven that this is what the Post can do. Take the unbelievable and show, despite all the denials of the president and his men, this is it. So having Marion Barry, saying, we don't know about this story, people wanted to believe it anyway. I mean, it's basically pimping on the Washington Post name is what it was. But, people, look, it was just a story. It wasn't a story. My problem with the story was that after it was found to be false, other black reporters coming up behind Janet Cooke caught hell. Other black reporters who were trying to get a job at the Washington Post went through the most intense and even sometimes humiliating, make sure that we didn't get another one of those again. It's like Donald Trump, banning everybody from these countries, on a smaller scale, of course. But yeah, it was people's instincts to protect themselves when they were afraid. People were afraid, people were shocked. But ultimately, the story itself was, nobody was hurt during the making of this story because it was a fake hit. When they asked, I wanted to see how this played out. Again, I'm here to live and learn. I had no idea how a paper like the Washington Post worked, how a town like Washington worked. So this was, wow, what's going to happen next? And because I had written about that kind of subject before, I was eventually asked, well, what do you think? I thought it was not true. But by then, it was too late. It was too late. It was out there. After she won the Pulitzer, and the questions started rolling in, I was asked again, to go out with her. But not to find Jimmy, because this Jimmy had a dad who was threatening Janet's life, and we weren't going to go messing around with that Jimmy. So we were supposed to go out and find another Jimmy, which would be Jimmy number 3, find another 8-year-old heroin addict out there. And I'm saying, wow, this is so bizarre. So that's what we did, went looking for, But I thought, why look for the third Jimmy? Let's go where she said the second Jimmy lived, the one that you wrote about. There was supposed to be, I guess, on every corner, all scattered all around the city, these little kids who were mainlining, potent heroin that was, people said they didn't know what it was, but it was basically a version of fentanyl, which is that, stuff that they came up with at the U.S. Naval Research Center. Chemical form. It would kill you by looking at it, and but not Jimmy. No, I mean I laugh at it because it's just funny. It's just funny what how these things work. I don't think it. I had the impression that nobody got really hurt. Maybe some egos were bruised. Ben emerged as Ben. Woodward emerged as the wealthiest, most prominent, guy. Nobody attaches Janet's name to them. Janet got $500,000 for a script on a screenplay that never got made, but she still got paid. It was the game. It was a game of nerves. Who had the nerve? Janet had the nerve. Boy, she had the nerve. And she almost pulled it off. It just, and if she had, I think I probably would have paid a price, because the thought was, even though I had been asked for my opinion when I expressed it that I didn't think it was true, it was like, oh, he's just being jealous, which means in effect that I was lying on a colleague because I didn't want her to succeed. So if she had succeeded, my ass would have been grass, no doubt about it. So, So yeah, I was happy that it blew up, but it was not it was not, to see her suffer anything. I just found it, it was a fun game. You have to bear with me on the recollected memory. I tried to think about how it really went down in the moment, but I do know that questions were being asked about it. And here was the dilemma that I thought was just delicious. If the Post didn't identify Jimmy, that means that they were abetting a murder or attempted murder, right, on an 8-year-old, which was like funny. So they had to find a way to reveal this kid, or the Post would be morally bankrupt. I mean, there's just no way you can justify watching an 8-year-old die like that. But there was no Jimmy, so there was no real dilemma. But, which is what the thing is so interesting, because all of this dilemma came up over fiction. I mean, it was like a hypothetical. What would you do if? Howard Simon did not like this. He didn't. The whole idea of the Post being in that position, no, but they didn't want to make Janet tell her who her sources were, so they sent Janet and I out to find another one. And so we got in the car and drove around a little bit, and I wanted to kind of get to see where Jimmy was. Again, the city is not that big. People know things. If she could put her business cards out on a playground and it would cause Jimmy's mother to call, wow, that means a lot of people must have known about Jimmy, So we went to these places, and eventually it occurred to me that Janet didn't have any idea where she was in the city. We were right in the neighborhood where every street in the neighborhood where Jimmy supposedly lived, and where this man with the knife was going to kill her if, found out about it. She didn't have a clue. And then she was getting really frightened and angry, and that was sad. But again, she still had a lot of nerve, which was pretty impressive. That's a lot of nerve. But getting caught in a lie, see, any human being knows, oh my goodness, the lie is falling apart. Anybody who's lived long enough knows what it's like to get caught in something like that, even as a kid. And I saw the kid come out in her, And I didn't hammer anything home. People think, oh, he ratted her out. No. I didn't ask to be a part of any of it. I was asked to see what I thought, and I said, I don't buy it, and that was pretty much, yeah, sure you don't. I think they believed me, and they said, holy shit, we got a problem, But when it all came out in the wash, it was like, well, we have to figure out why we didn't believe Courtland. Let's say this, that's that. But that became the reality of it, We have to, we got this guy who's professional jealousy. But again, look, in the scheme of things, it was part of the integration process. It's a hard road to hoe, People clashing, people coming up against each other's view of the world, people trying to make it, people trying to make it. We were talking now about moving from social justice to economic justice. Janet Cooke wanted to get paid, as righteous. She wanted to move to a position where you got more money, a little more prestige, And that was not going to be easy, no matter how you sliced it. Because for her to get it meant that someone else would have to give it up, and that someone else would probably be white, So she used all the tricks in the book. Yeah, my mind was blown. But again, living and learning. If this was what was considered Pulitzer standards, that's all I had to say, wow, I don't, my notion had been that this is, might be something that's nice to have, a Pulitzer Prize. But after that, it's like, I don't think so. This is pretty corny stuff. And I was pleased to find that Bradlee basically thought the same thing after the Post got stiff for Pulitzer Prizes during the Watergate, thing that the paper was up for maybe almost 4 prizes. He got 1, you know. Other people's prizes got traded away in the little backroom dealings that goes on. And I learned about that, how it really works because of Janet Cooke. I thought, you know, you can keep that. I was also disappointed that Janet Cooke's prize came at the expense of a friend of mine named Henry Mitchell, who was the garden writer. But him writing about a garden was like writing about the essence of human life. You know, one of those guys who could see the, you know, the mini universe in a, you know, in a pod of a sunflower type thing. And he was a cool guy. And he was dying of, I believe, prostate or pancreatic cancer at the time. And I just thought, wow, you know, he really wrote his ass off for this one. And he was in there. He was the winner. And they switched it around. They switched it around. And I thought that was messed up more than anything else. But when the prize was announced and all of the stuff started gushing in, that blew me away. I didn't understand why people were rooting for a story about an 8-year-old on heroin who'd never been found. You know, basically they were rooting for a corpse, you know, a little black corpse. And I thought, wow, she was getting flowers and all these congratulatory notes, you know. It's like Trump revealing so much about, you know, other people around him. He highlights a lot of things, duplicity, hypocrisy. You know, Janet Cooke had that effect, you know. She let people see some things about themselves that they weren't pleased about. And to that extent, it's good. A little self, you know, some introspection. You know, how could this happen? You know, why did we get so involved in this like that? And I think that was good. Again, we're into the integration process at a very psychological level now. This is not physical violence. This is getting inside people's head and wreaking havoc. At some level, I think they knew that story was fake, which is why they could do it. I'm just figuring that this is, you know, it was a hypothetical. It wasn't a real kid. The sensibilities of Bob Woodward, Howard Simon, Ben Bradlee, that's not how they thought. This had to be in another dimension. You know, they had to know at some level that this was not real, you know. Because the standard of journalism, remember what we're talking about here, a 5-year-old mainlining potent heroin, then going to school talking about, yeah, maybe a math whiz man, all that kind of stuff, you know. The most naive person would say this is bogus. They were journalists, and like I said, even in high school, the basic principles of newspaper journalism had been the same, you know. You fact check. Here's a kid that was going to school, which means that he had to come to the attention of somebody. He had a teacher, you know. He had friends. There was some way to at least, you know, triangulate, if you will, his existence. You know, there's no way you can just exist like that, unless you think DC was some kind of zoo, you know. But again, just based on basic journalism, you know, people kind of knew. At worst, it was just institutional racism. You know, there were enough people involved in that you know, that's the only thing I can say. The system. It was the same system in which year after year, you could look at the pay scale. White men, black women, black women at the bottom. And it was always like that. It still is, you know, that's structural. And there were a lot of other structural things in the Post that made, that put black people down at the bottom of the barrel, you know, and they wanted to see more of it. It was on automatic. There's a certain amount of things just happening as it did day to day. You know, the paper gets reinvented every day, kind of quick thoughts, boom, 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 decisions made, boom, we're gonna run with it, you know. And by the time the doubts were in, I think when Woodward said, okay, you know, no point in pulling out now, and after it ran, got the Pulitzer in for a dime. This was before the Pulitzer. And they said, we submitted it, we ran it, you know, boom. So their doubts hard to disprove, or to, say that the negative is not there, so sure. And people talking about how well it was written and what a pretty girl wrote it. Again, new things, new people, new ways of being. The Post drew people in from all over the country, and I don't think people realize how different we are. It's just an amazing thing that we've only had one civil war in this country, because people are so different. Come from, it's like coming from another planet. And Janet Cooke came from another planet. She was hardly recognized by anybody black, but white people thought they knew her based on her paper, Vassar, Sorbonne, Phi Beta Kappa. All the rest of the stuff didn't matter. I think one of the most sensitive of the editors, and actually one of the best editors at the Post I've worked with, was David Marinus. I think they had a relationship in which they could talk. Generally, he was an excellent interviewer, so, get things out. I think that's probably one of the people. But it was a combination of pressures. The Post is a tough place. They get grilled. They do the good cop, bad cop thing, and they can both put a hurting on you. So, but again, newsrooms are like that. There aren't any such thing as a nice newsroom, because it's a fight for, reality. Whose reality is it? Whose point of view matters? Whose objectivity, will be our standard? And it was shifting, and Janet Cooke was torn. She just, she had this new eye implant, seeing things one way, but I think deep down kind of feeling different. She got a lot of glory for it, though, and $500,000. Remember that? I thought after a while that she should have kept that prize. They should not have given the prize back, because that was the standard that they went by. That's who they were. Give it back for what? They wheeled and dealed and got it in. They should, she should kept it. It said fabricated all over it, and it still put it in there. But journalism prizes are just, it's what people like at the time, what that group liked, and that's what the group went with, and they should kept it. They renamed it the Roxanne Pulitzer Prize, who I thought if I got a Pulitzer, it would be named for Roxanne Pulitzer, the wayward daughter, But now these prizes, why not, shoot, a pioneer in fake news. Her time has come. She was just ahead of her time, No, I really hold no animosity. I thought it was just the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. It was thrilling. It was thrilling to see how people work with this. Ben is expert at damage control. Howard Simons is just a master, strategies of all sorts. I mean, he was the driving force behind Watergate. And it was interesting to see people work with this. How do we get our ass out of this sling? Look, race integration is not an easy thing. People don't know what they don't know. It takes a long time. This has been in the process a long time. You couldn't expect Bill to understand the racial implications of it, how race played a factor, or the nature of the creative tension game. You needed nerve. You needed to be competitive. You need to be able to withstand stuff. Kay Graham set the standard, a high bar for having nerve. I mean, they said that she was ballsy. Ben followed with his brass clankers. Woodward and Bernstein, clankers. They valued nerve in that place. You went with it, you stood by it. And that's what the writing business was. You put it out there, and you stand by it. And Janet Cooke did. And she held on till the very last. God, she held on. You had to admire her for that. Yeah, So, but she revealed things that were very important to reveal. That we all have these little weak spots. Ben says, anybody can be con, but he put it on the con person. Oh, the con man will say, well, if you hadn't been this or that, you wouldn't have been con. Usually greedy, you know. That's the way it worked. They wanted that thing. They wanted it, They wanted it so bad they could taste it. That little chocolate girl with the weave, they liked that so much. Oh, I found that so fascinating. So anyway, feminine mystique. Well, the immediate effect was to subject all new black applicants to the third degree. And anybody who brought, now you understand that most black people were concentrated in the social welfare part of the, reporting business. They had too many of us, first of all, writing about pathology, when the Washington, D.C. community was basically a middle class with deep, rich culture. But that was given short shrift for the pathology. So anybody who would bring back a story about welfare, anything, it was like they were grilled on it. How do you know this is true? Who are your sources? Who did this? We're going to have to talk to them. Creative tension was designed to get people really energized, even with this little fear. It was anxiety about getting, reaching the ideal, the vision that was set out by the manager, which was impact, make a difference, make people think. If that was what the object was, well, what came next was totally demoralizing. It was like, don't bring us this stuff without it being, like this. Suck the air out. Editing started becoming censorship, because the paper was in a protective, defensive crouch around that stuff. And black reporters paid the price, not just at the Post, but at all newspapers where black reporters were working. This was a big deal for the press. I think the National Association of Editors or something like that asked me, the American Society of Newspaper Editors were meeting at the time, and Ben Bradlee was Exhibit A, Don Graham. But they survived it, learned from it, and why not? Black people had to learn more, but it was harder for black people to integrate than for white people to kind of make room for it. But the fact of the matter was, none of it would have happened if Don Graham, Ben Bradlee, and Howard Simons had not been committed to bringing black people into the newsroom in the first place. That's one way they could avoid the whole thing, keep the newsroom white. Maybe you have another kind of thing, one of those, white people making up a little story or something like that, but it's not the same. Ben, what I can understand about the Brahmin is that, he really wasn't into, and he wasn't, I wanted to be an elitist. He didn't even, his gravelly voice disguised, he might have talked, had he embraced that identity like John F. Kennedy with that, Kennedy-esque thing. But no, he put gravel on his. Down and down to earth kind of guy, talk like that, And when he come in the newsroom, he come to me and he talk about, what's up, my brother? He wanted to be like a brother. And over time, he actually learned how to do a high five right. At first he started out, it was way up high. He slapped his hand like he was trying to do a basketball play. But in the end, it was like a low high five with a little pop to it. Brother. I always thought Ben had a secret desire to kind of have some, black part of it, because it was just the culture. He took stuff from the Irish. He got some of that ballsy stuff from like being you thought he was a brawler. He got that from the Irish. If he was black, he'd been a hustler. And if a hustlers on the street had Bradlee's connection, they'd be running the paper too. It was like that. He had that. He was perceived like as had the suave of a jewel thief, a little Cary Grant type of guy, but he added to that over time. As the newsroom became more integrated, he started becoming like Billy D. Williams, smooth operator, putting it on there. He had to walk. And it was fun to watch. And you knew he was trying to learn. He'd always ask, who is that black person? Every time you saw a black person, I guess you were supposed to know, who is that one? Who is that person? What does he do? And it's like, you don't want to tell blacks that you don't know every black person in the world because it's like, well, what are you here for? I'm trying to learn. You know, you want to learn. It was crude, but it was honest. You know, it was honest. I found out a lot of things about that. Wealthy people have a lot in common with really poor people. Their flamboyance, their fearlessness. They're like, you know, it's almost like what you have to lose. You know, you're not going to take anything from Bradlee, really. You know, that's 100-year-old Brahma type thing. More than that, you know, and what you're going to take from the poor people. The only difference is poor people can't hide their stuff. You know, and Bradlee didn't want to hide it. You know, his was right out there in the open, you know, and it was kind of cool to watch him maneuver. Now, I'm from the South, so this was new to me. There were black people from the Martha's Vineyard, you know, place who were familiar with that New England Brahmin stuff, and they did, you know, and they were as, you know, they didn't tolerate that. They didn't, you don't, you know, get gruff around them, you know. But again, I thought Brahmin was bull, and that was what he was, the bull. It was interesting, very colorful, very charismatic, you know. And if you wanted to see how the real power of charm, you know, you watch him and you say, you have a certain kind of smile. Oh, he was reinventing himself, and you know, he was trying to add some substance to this identity. I mean, you watch the Masterpiece Theater and you see Alistair Cook sitting up there and you wonder, well, what the hell does he do after he's finished with the program? You know, he probably goes and irons his socks or something, you know. You know, Bradlee wanted some, you know, he honed his people skills. You know, he had some connections and he operated with some high-powered people. You know, he had good counselors to help him with to maneuver in that world, but himself, he wanted to be down with the people, you know. And it wasn't like Steve Martin trying to be black, but you know, sometimes it had that kind of funny, you know, you kind of feeling like, oh man, if he wanted to be able to dance, if he could just really dance good, he would be, you know, that would be cool, you know. Just wanted that extra thing, you know, and so. Anyway, it's all about being human. It's all about the mind changing, you know, and all about trying to do right. You know, how much right can I do without losing my good stuff? You know, most people didn't try. Most newspapers to this day are, you know, all white. You know, most don't really go that extra length. You know, but they did, and they had some successes. Some good successes. They were filming that movie when I came. Actually, a few months after I came, I think it was more of a reward. I was walking around the corner, Newsroom, and I bumped right into Katharine Graham. I mean, boom, buxom to the chest, boom, hit. And I was terrified. I said, oh, excuse me. She says, for what? You know, it was like, you know, I knock you back. You knock me back. She was a tough one. But I got passes to a premiere from her of this movie. You know, I think they were still doing some extra filming. The camera thing was still in. Like I said, they were putting some sheen on this trade. They were spending, you know, turning that ink into black gold. And they had made a movie, heroic. Yeah, it's fun. When I came, the applications, literally, to be at the Washington Post was rising to the ceiling, floor to ceiling. People wanted to be there, you know. And I had just accidentally, but, you know, just accident. It was almost like I was on a cosmic wave to come and be a part, watch this integration process go on. That's what it was. Again, I'm from Louisiana. It was not, people died, you know, people were killed for this thing called integration, you know, and here I was, right, you know, somehow or another through this affirmative action thing. It wasn't just that, it was good people. Ben, Lynn Downing. I had a black editor from Little Rock, Arkansas, who basically kept me there. He said, we're going to give him a chance. I'm going to work with him. Otherwise, I'd been gone. Oh, this was Herbert Denton. He was the mentor for Milton Coleman and myself and a lot of others. You know, really. A Harvard grad who had been in Vietnam at Stars and Stripes with Don Graham. And when Don started to make his move to, you know, push for more local coverage, including the black community, you know, he got this Herb Denton there, his buddy, his war buddy, you know, to come. And, you know, it just happened that I come at that time. You know, it just so happened that there was a black security guard who let me wait in the lobby until Elsie Carper, who was the white woman personnel, you know, director for the Newsroom, who'd been at the paper since 1939, but who was very progressive, says, okay, you know, give me an application, you know, we'll call you if, you know, if we see something we like, you know, and then you come into Ben Bradlee's world. Again, Bradlee one-on-one was he was just a really cool dude. He was trying. You just saw a guy who did not have to put himself out. You know, he didn't have to, but he did. And he wasn't patronizing too much, I don't think, with black people. He'd say what he thought. You know, he'd call you asshole if you wanted to. And even the people he called asshole. See, there were guys who were like much more sophisticated than I was. Black guys, you know, much more talented than I was. And they go toe to toe with Bradlee. You know, I mean, the people who were most responsible for me being there were 7 black reporters who filed an EEOC suit against the Washington Post, having met with Bradlee many times and argued ferociously with him because he didn't want to be perceived as a racist. How could he be a racist, you know? And I thought so too. Now this guy, one of the things Bradlee did was give me a copy of Conversations with Kennedy, you know? And I'm saying, wow, this guy was with John Kennedy. Now Kennedy's picture, along with Martin Luther King, was on a lot of homes that I'd done interviews in. People respected them. And here was, you know, I'm rubbing shoulders with the guy who rubbed shoulders with, you know, had his arms around Jackie O. You know, Ben Bradlee, so smooth. He couldn't be a racist, right? You know, but it wasn't about, you come to understand that it's not so much about the person being a racist. It's about what is the milieu that he's working in? What is the inheritance? You know, what is the structural inheritance that people have found themselves in that they are obligated to protect, you know, if they want to get paid too? You know, so the fact that Bradlee would put, you know, the establishment at risk the way he did, just said something about it. He's going to just break stuff up. And that was good, you know, because the only way the structure was going to change. Of course, it only went so far, you know. We are what we are, and still a long way to go, and he knew that.